The Bible speaks authoritatively about, would you believe, quantum physics? Yes, it does. And here to talk about quantum physics and many, many other subjects today, author Josh Peck. I've got a couple of his books right here, Cherubim Chariots and Quantum Creation. Josh Peck, welcome to Prophecy Watchers.
Well, thank you so much for having me back on. It's always a blast talking to you, and I always leave blessed.
Well, we do too, and I have to tell you, the word quantum and Christianity would not seem to go together.
No.
And yet, from a Christian perspective, you're writing about God's creation and about biblical prophecy, biblical historical facts, things that are observed in the Bible that can be seen through the lens of modern physical research, modern scientific, mathematical research. In fact, the people who, with their blackboards and their chalk, writing all those long formulas and so forth, are really trying to describe what God created, right?
Yeah, and they don't interpret it that way, but that's exactly what they're doing.
and that's where you come in.
Yes.
And which of these books would you like to talk about first, Quantum Creation or Cherubim Chariots?
Well, we can start off with Quantum Creation. That lays a lot of the framework for any discussion of quantum physics or really even science. But specifically quantum physics, how to integrate the Bible with that. We were talking before the show, and you had asked me how I got interested in this, and I told you that ever since I was a kid, I was interested in science, but I was also a Christian, so I didn't have like an environment that could show me how to bring the two together. I always kind of felt like it had to be one or the other. So of course, I would go with the Christian stuff.
Yes.
But later on in life, I learned that actually, when you have true science and you have a true interpretation of what the Bible's saying, they go hand in hand perfectly. The problem is, and I think this is why a lot of Christians kind of still have this idea that there's a dichotomy between the two. There's a difference between interpretation and observation. So you and I can observe something, say a Bible verse or an experiment at CERN or something. We can observe something but come away with two different interpretations of what it means, even though it's the same thing we're looking at. And we as Christians, we've seen this all the time with different interpretations of Bible verses and things. You can look at one Bible verse and come up with 5 different things. Well, scientists have that too. Physicists have that too. There are Christian physicists, not a lot of them, but I know a couple of them. They've provided interviews for my books and really nice guys, but they agree with all the physics stuff, they just interpret it differently. So where one physicist will say something like, well, quantum field theory, which we don't need to get into that because it's a whole other thing, but it proves there's no afterlife because there's no field to take information anywhere. One physicist will say that, where another one will say, well, quantum field theory or string theory proves God because all this energy has to come from somewhere. And physicists agree that it's not our reality that this energy is coming from. So it's the same observation. It doesn't mean that quantum fields don't exist or that string theory isn't true. It just means that there's different interpretations. So if you have the true interpretation of science and the true interpretation of the Bible, they'll go hand in hand.
Now, true interpretation of the Bible. How does someone decide what that is? We see things in the Bible that have always been described as mystical. And for example, I think Exhibit A in the whole Bible would be Ezekiel Chapter One,
Yes.
where Ezekiel sees this phenomenal thing and he describes it. And so many different interpretations down through the millennia have been given for what Ezekiel saw. Depending on what you believe, this is a spiritual vision. Some people say, well, no, he had an encounter with something that was close to him. It was a fiery wheel that came in and it landed in front of him. And some people say, well, that sounds a lot like a UFO. Other people will say, no, that was a vision that God put into Ezekiel's head. It wasn't a real thing as we think of real. And so there's an argument about what biblical reality is. And if you go to the secular world, as you well know, and I'm setting up a question here. If you go to the secular world, as you well know, secularists, secular scientists are trying to understand the creation in terms of quantum mathematics and quantum science, and that we call spirituality.
Yeah.
In the Christian world, we would not say quantum science. We
Right.
would say this is a spirit world. So you're bringing those two things together.
Yeah, because all it is we're looking at the same things. You know, us as Christians, we look at spiritual reality. Physicists are looking at that too. They just don't call it that. You know, they'll call it extra dimensions or parallel universes, things like that. But they're looking at the same thing and trying to understand it. They understand that there's a reality around us. Now, we have, as Christians, we've known that for thousands of years. And a lot of ancient cultures have had some idea of it, but of course we believe the Bible gives the most accurate and the only true explanation of all that stuff. So they're trying to come at it purely, usually atheistic. Again, there are a couple Christians, but not many. Usually it's atheistic. They come at it from a strictly mathematical, material point of view. But that's already starting to break down with physics, because the material worldview, which is just basically there's no reality besides what we can see and touch and interact with, that's going out the window. Because now they understand more about quantum physics, more that there actually are extra dimensions. There's physical evidence of extra dimensions interacting with our own. There's a lot of different experiments that can be used as evidence towards that fact. The only part that they're missing is the Bible, which is the most important part. But we as Christians, we're in a unique position where that is our starting point, you know? Jesus Christ is our starting point. It can bring things like quantum physics into focus. And I talk about this a lot in, well, both books, but in Quantum Creation especially. And by the way, I don't want the viewer at home to be afraid by that title. This will not be over anyone's head. Yeah.
Very readable.
Yes, and I've gone to great lengths to make sure, because God's creation, I believe, is accessible to everybody, and that's really what we're looking at, God's creation, the building blocks of reality. And understanding that can give us greater appreciation for the Creator himself, you know. Well, I think that God would make that accessible to everybody. You know, anyone who has an interest in it should be able to understand it just fine. You know, maybe not all the crazy mathematics. I don't understand any of that. But the main concepts of what reality is, how God put us all together, how and this is one of the coolest things for me. His energy, his voice is holding us together right now, currently. Hebrews 11:3 tells us that.
Yeah.
Phenomenal.
It is phenomenal. Something else struck me a long time ago, and I think you and I have talked about this in the past, but I'm going to bring it up again. In Ephesians chapter 3, Paul says, starting in verse 17, that Christ may dwell in your hearts by faith, that you being rooted and grounded in love may be able to comprehend with all saints what is the breadth, length, depth, and height, and to know the love of Christ. And Paul gives 4 dimensions
Yeah.
here.
And
Now,
it's so cool.
You know, and you can read right past that
Yes.
and not, wait a minute, Paul's giving 4 dimensions. What does that mean?
Yeah, exactly. And it's that God's love transcends all of reality, even the reality that we can't perceive, you know. And that 4th dimension, when you look at it in the Hebrew, it's a spatial dimension, you know. Now, there's one of them that could be read as time. And so really it's kind of either or, just kind of whatever your preference is.
Yeah.
You can read one of them as time, but it's also possible that all 4 of them are spatial in nature. And that kind of is the jumping off point for my book, Quantum Creation, Does the Supernatural Lurk in the 4th Dimension? Usually we think of the 4th dimension as time, and that's correct, but there's also a 4th dimension of space. So we live in 3 spatial.
And Paul really mentioned it or writes about it in
Yeah.
such a way that it could be taken both ways.
And I think he did that on purpose. I think that he's saying that, you know, whether we're talking about space or time, God's love, his love, his essence permeates all that, holds it all together. And he wants us to understand that. You know, that's what Paul's saying there. And it really, this is something else that we sort of talked about before recording, but it really does show that love is the most important thing, you know, in all of this.
The book is Quantum Creation, quantum. Let's define the word quantum.
Sure.
Hey,
Yeah, basically quantum, it's just the smallest of the small, the most fundamental building block of reality. If you had like a Lego set, it would be whatever the smallest Lego was. So
and they're
it's-
arguing about what that is, right?
Yeah, exactly. They are. Yeah, they still don't know for sure. Right now, string theory is making some headway, saying, well, strings are the most fundamental reality. But there's also one that I talk about in Abaddon Ascending, which we've talked about before, called quantum field theory, which says that it's quantum fields. We don't have to get into all that. But basically, it's just the effort to study the basic building blocks of reality, the idea that all these different things that we see on the macro scale are actually essentially made of the same stuff, and trying to define what that stuff is. And to me, it's a fascinating study. I mean, it really does lend more appreciation to our Creator, because it ultimately does go back to love. You mentioned before the program how astounding a simple passage as God is love, how astounding that is. It's the whole reason that we're here. That's the whole reason that quantum strings vibrate or quantum fields vibrate. It's his creative voice into our reality, but that voice is spawned from love, from his love for us. Isn't that amazing?
And where you find our Lord, and where you find Jesus, you find love.
That's right.
Boom. It's that simple.
Yes.
And yet we tend to overlook and forget that. We go to the technology, the techniques, the history, the factuality. We go to a list of things that we want to remember. But wait a minute, love is right there at number one.
Yes.
God is love, which is, I think, a mystery that I won't solve for a long, long time.
Same here. I think, maybe we'll have a chance when we're on the other end of eternity.
And I hope so. I hope to experience that love in a much greater way.
Me too.
A direct way, rather than here on earth, where we're told about it, we have to accept it by faith, and God wanted it that way.
Yeah. Yeah, because that really brings the importance of faith and his grace towards us, and it puts a lot of things in a human perspective that we can understand while we're here, to make the right decision, to follow Jesus day to day. So then when we're there, all of that's going to make sense.
Yes. Now, let's go to your second book.
Sure.
Cherubim Chariots. And on the front, you have a phenomenal creature on
Yes.
the cover. And of course, the ultimate cherubim chariot is found in Ezekiel Chapter One.
Yes.
And I think a lot of people have spent a lot of time trying to figure out what Ezekiel really saw. And I don't think we'll ever figure it out.
No.
It's way above our pay grade,
Yes,
right?
it is.
Let's talk about that. Let's
Yeah.
talk about the cherubim for a minute, because cherubim are very special creatures, and they serve a very special role in God's universe.
Yeah, we know of at least 4 of them that are around the throne of God, and they have a specific role too, even in how God chooses to get around. And I word it that way because I get a question a lot, like, why does God need a vehicle to get from point A to point B?
Right.
He doesn't. He wants one.
Yeah.
He's God. He can have it if he wants it,
Sure. And more power to it.
Yeah. Who are we to question?
And seriously, the prophets, the Old Testament prophets, talk about the Merkava Moftim, the chariot of glory that God gets to from one place to another in. And the prophet Samuel talks about the fact that God rides on the backs of the cherubim.
Yeah.
And again, somebody might say, well, why does he do that? And the answer is because he wants to.
Yeah.
So, but it's left to us to decide what these cherubim are. We're
Yeah.
given glimpses of them in Revelation, and we're given a glimpse of one later in Ezekiel and in Isaiah 14. We sort of get an edge-on view.
Yeah.
So what are you writing about?
Yeah, well, the cherubim are a specific class of angelic being, of angel, and there's different, there's cherubim, seraphim, ophanim, the actual wheels that are described in that same passage in Ezekiel Chapter 1, the wheel within a wheel. That's actually a class of angel. That's an angel. That's a living being, and it describes it as such. Says it has eyes around the rims, and And usually we read that and think of something mechanical, and it is from like a heavenly standpoint, but it also says there's a spirit in there. It's an actual being. And Daniel talks about the Ophanim. We get that from the Hebrew. But so it's really interesting. But there's also fallen cherubim. There are cherubim that have decided to reject God and everything that He has for them, and those are depicted in the cultures around Israel, in that region, as things like Lamassu and Shadu, which are basically the opposite of what Ezekiel described. So in Ezekiel's description of the cherubim, it's something like what's on the cover here. Ezekiel's way more complex than that, but basically it's a humanoid type of body with wings, and then an animal type of head. Well, in the surrounding cultures in ancient time, around Ezekiel's time, it was the complete opposite. It was they would create these statues, kings and stuff. They would create these statues to stand at the doorposts of their kingdom, of their palace, and they gave them the names, usually Lamassu and Shadu. But they're animal type of bodies, usually a lion or an ox or something with a human head.
We see a winged lion like that.
Yes.
In Babylon.
Yeah, exactly. It's a perfect example.
And the Sphinx.
Yep, the Sphinx, that's another perfect example. So the ancient cultures had this idea, but it was an antithesis of what Ezekiel saw. Ezekiel saw the good guys, the guys around the throne of God. The bad guys, the ones that have fallen, are completely antithetical. So they're different in every way. And actually, there's a really interesting passage in Revelation 9, that talks about the locusts that come out of the abyss. One of the descriptions is they have lion's teeth, but then like a human type of head. They're bisected horizontally. In Ezekiel's vision, he talks about the same thing. And you really got to get into the Hebrew to pull this out of it. The English, it does okay, but it's hard to get this in the English. But Ezekiel talks about the same thing, part lion, part human, but bisected vertically. And then even later in the book of Ezekiel, in chapter 40, don't quote me on the verse, but it's in there. He talks about in the heavenly temple depictions of the same cherubim bisected vertically. So even where the bisection takes place, it's antithetical. The fallen are bisected in a different way. They're set up in a completely opposite way. I believe it's because the enemy has no original thoughts of their own. Satan has no original idea of his own. He has to take from God and then alter and skew it to his own evil devices. And then that's what you're left with, things like the locust from Revelation 9.
And then we have, of course, the Ark of the Covenant. And we have two cherubim atop the Ark, and nobody has any idea what they looked like.
Exactly.
But in the Temple of Solomon, they were huge.
Yeah.
I think they spanned about 30 feet at the front of the temple with their wings spread out. Nobody has the slightest idea what they looked like.
And Ezekiel gives us a little bit of more description on that, because in Ezekiel, now this is the future heavenly temple, but in that he talks about that same lion-man bisection of because it says something like on the left side was one, on the right side was the other. That other vertical bisection, and I don't know what the meaning behind that is. All I can do is observe that it says that.
But you've given it a lot of thought.
Yes.
Hence the book Cherubim, Chariots. And when you begin to look at the function of angels, you may not get to the end of the matter, because it's far more complex or far higher than we're capable of grasping, I think, at this level. But on the other hand, it's a great search. It's a great research, because it gives you so much insight into so many other places. That's the wonderful part about this book.
Yeah, it does. And the cool thing is, too, about all of this is it gives us more insight on God, because the same thing could be asked about angels that people ask about the chariots, the chariot of God. Well, if God can do everything, why does he need angels?
Right.
Well, he doesn't. He wants them. It's the same answer. Why does he need us? He doesn't. He loves us, and he wants us. And I think that understanding those aspects of his creation, not why does he need them, but why does he want these? What does that do for God? I think that gives us more appreciation for his love for us and our purpose in him.
There's a lot of emotion in the Bible, and I was thinking about it as you're talking. And Ezekiel's emotions run very, very deep.
Yeah.
And his emotional reaction to this thing that he saw is palpable.
Yeah.
You can just hear the quick breath and the fast heartbeat. Ezekiel is seeing things that he can barely grasp. And the whole prophecy of Ezekiel is cast in a highly, if you will, emotional tone or state. And I think that's part of God's will for man. He does not want us to be complacent. He doesn't want us just to sit around. And he wants us to be awe-stricken, is what I'm trying to say. And we are when we look at this subject.
Yeah, and looking at his creation, things that he's already done, is a really good starting point, because it really does show, like we talked about before, that God is love. And that's the most awe-striking thing of all, because it explains why Jesus died on the cross for us. It explains why we exist at all. Why did he tell us things before they're going to happen in prophecy and stuff? It's because he loves us. Now, somebody might ask, well, why did he leave it ambiguous? Why isn't it more specific, things like prophecy? Why do we have different interpretations? I believe that's because he wants us to love each other. He wants us to get along despite us not knowing things.
Right.
And there is nothing else that will take somebody's pride out of them than not knowing something,
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, you have to accept things by faith.
Exactly.
And faith comes by hearing, hearing by the word of God. It's a whole rotational study process. It's called Christian growth.
Yes. and for me, that's been one of the most phenomenal journeys in life is Christian growth.
Let's talk for a minute about a tesseract. Have you ever heard the word tesseract? Tessaract. Look it up.
Yeah.
And this figures in your book.
Yeah.
And tell us how and why. I love the fact that a tesseract, when it's presented in a certain way, looks like the cross.
I know, and it's really cool because Ezekiel's vision, the cherubim have that same kind of cross-like figure to them. Basically, a tesseract is what happens when you take a four-dimensional cube, and we're talking about four spatial dimensions, so not time, dimensions of space. A cube that has 4 dimensions of space, which don't even try to picture it because we can't.
Right.
But if it's unfolded into our dimension, and it's this big fancy term that physicists use called extra dimensional unfolding, which somebody's just going to read that word and not want to even bother with it. But it is really cool because what that shows is that you can take an object that's extra dimensional, something from another realm, and you can do something to manipulate it into our reality into a way that we can understand. So a good example of how we might get our head around this is if you took a normal cube and you wanted to present it to a hypothetical being of only 2 dimensions, a flatlander. Chuck Missler's used this example a lot. You can take this cube, this 3-dimensional object, and you can unfold it into 6 squares, which just by happenstance, I'm sure, makes a figure of the cross. But you can lay that flat, and now the flatlander has the most information possible about what a cube is. He won't be able to put in his mind what it looks like.
Now, interruption.
Yeah.
If you want to know what a tesseract looks like and what it looks like unfolded, it's right in the book.
Yes.
In both books, Quantum Creation.
I provide plenty of pictures.
You've got the pictures, and it's really fascinating the way you've put that together. I love it. So go ahead.
Yeah. So the flatlander can actually see this object. Now, he can't put together in his head what the completed, folded thing would look like, but he at least has access to the information. So it's the same with us. We can think of a tesseract, which is basically it's a cross with 2 extra arms, but they're made of cubes. Same idea, 8 cubes. We have the information of what a tesseract would look like based on that figure, but we can't fold it back up in our minds and think about what a hypercube would look like.
Right.
Now, the interesting thing, imagine you have a tesseract, and then imagine if you want to unfold that again so a 2-dimensional being could understand it. Well, now you're going to start to have some of those squares taking up the same space as other squares. That's exactly what Ezekiel's describing.
It is.
In Ezekiel, he describes how these angels are, their wings, their feet, they're taking up the same space. They're like melded together. That's because they're extra dimensional. They're being unfolded in a way that Ezekiel can understand, but because he can't see the extra space, to him they appear as melded together. And that also shows how this is not just a vision. This is a physical thing.
Did you ever think about the fact that the New Jerusalem is four square?
Yes.
It's let down from heaven. And is it possible that it's a folded cube?
Yes, I believe it's a tesseract, and we've talked about that. I think it's an actual literal hypercube. And because you can take the measurements, and the measurements still make sense even with that. You can have another big fancy term, extra-dimensional mathematics, which sounds way more exotic than it really is. And actually, there's this physics book that I read, which it's funny. It shows how a table of mathematics in 3 dimensions works. In 4 dimensions, you just add 2 extra rows. That's it. Super easy. but the math still works with a hypercube. It's phenomenal.
If you like Josh's excitement, you're going to find it in both of his books, Cherubim Chariots and Quantum Creation. And by the way, we have those in the Prophecy Watchers online bookstore. Just go to prophecywatchers.com and click the bookstore, scroll down, and you're going to find Josh Peck's name and his books. And we're offering either of these books separately. We're offering them as a pair, the Josh Peck package, which you'll find in the bookstore. And when you order the Josh Peck package, not only will you save money, but you'll also get a couple of bonus items. And I have them right here. Josh spoke at our Rocky Mountain Prophecy Conference on July 15th through 17th in the year 2016.
Yes.
And I heard you speak, by the way.
Oh, did you?
Always very exciting and upbeat when you talk.
Well, when you talk about this kind of stuff, for me, I mean, it all comes back to Jesus, and that excites me.
Well, the Josh Peck package has the 2 books and free bonus presentations by Josh at the Prophecy Conference. And so you get a little extra there. And you're going to learn all about the hyperdimensional cube.
Yes. And again, for anybody out there that might be scared off by some of this stuff, I haven't had anybody tell me that this is over their heads. I've had 15-year-olds who have bought my books and said that they loved them, and I've had 85-year-old people even.
True story. I mean, he does not ride above your head, folks, but he excites you. He brings an excitement to the Bible that I love.
Yeah. Well, I love it too. And, I truly do just thank God for making his creation accessible to us. Anybody can understand this stuff. So anybody out there that has seen these scientists and physicists that want to tell you you're too stupid to understand it, don't believe them. That's garbage. You're not too stupid to understand it. God loves you. You can understand this stuff just fine.
Well, if you like the way Josh speaks, you love the way he writes. What can I say?
That.
Seriously, we could talk for another half hour.
Oh, yeah.
I'm just getting started because we haven't gone into a lot of detail at this point. What didn't we talk about in 15 seconds?
15, oh man. Well, I work for Skywatch TV. People, if they are interested in watching a TV show that's based on this stuff, they can check out Into the Multiverse, youtube.com/Into the Multiverse, and they'll see me and my lovely, beautiful wife every week.
Josh Peck, thanks for being with us at Prophecy Watch.
Thanks for having me.
I appreciate it. Lord bless you and yours.
Oh, Lord bless you too.
I love talking to this guy. And we've come to the end of our time. I'm Gary Stearman. Hey, keep watching. We are. Thanks for joining us on Prophecy Watchers. You can find us on the web at prophecywatchers.com. In the meantime, keep watching, everybody, and we'll see you soon.